There is a particular kind of silence that follows the moment you realize someone you trusted has been working very carefully and very quietly to destroy you. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath, right before the ground gives way beneath your feet. I know that silence better than I know almost anything else in this world. I lived inside it for nearly 3 years, and I am here to tell you that surviving it was the most clarifying experience of my entire life. People look at me now, the corner office, the staff of 12, the financial advisory practice I built entirely from scratch, and they assume I must have come from privilege. They assume someone handed me a foundation and I simply built upward from there. What they do not see, what I rarely talk about in professional settings, is that the foundation I stand on today was constructed from the rubble of a marriage that nearly cost me my sanity, my savings, and my unborn child. What they do not see is that the woman who tried hardest to take all of that from me was the woman who was supposed to become my family. I met my husband at a mutual friend's wedding in Charleston. He was warm and attentive and laughed at all the right moments. On our third date, he told me his mother was the most important person in his life, and I remember thinking that was sweet. I remember thinking it spoke well of his character. I was 28 years old and I had a lot left to learn about what that kind of devotion actually looks like when it goes wrong. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. My father had passed away 8 months before the engagement, leaving me a life insurance trust valued at just over $1.2 million. The trust was structured very specifically. My father had been a careful man, a retired estate attorney who had seen enough family disasters to know exactly what he was doing. The funds were accessible only to me, not to a spouse, not to any joint account. Only to me, unless I voluntarily transferred assets, or unless I was declared legally incompetent by a court. My father loved me, and he understood the world in a way I was still learning to understand it. My mother-in-law's name is Margaret. She is 71 years old, impeccably dressed, and one of the most dangerous people I have ever encountered. She has a way of smiling that never quite reaches her eyes. I noticed it early. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself I was projecting leftover grief from losing my father onto this new family I was gaining through marriage. I am a trained CPA. I work with numbers and patterns, and I am not a person who normally ignores data. But grief does something to your pattern recognition. It blurs the edges. And Margaret was very, very good at staying just inside the edges. The first year of our marriage was almost normal. Margaret called every Sunday. She offered opinions about our house and our finances and our future children with the casual authority of someone who has never once been told no. My husband, Daniel, received each opinion like a man receiving divine instruction. He would nod slowly during her calls, and then he would bring her suggestions to me as though they were his own ideas, and when I pushed back, he would grow quiet in a way that felt less like disagreement and more like a door closing. I got pregnant 14 months into our marriage. We had talked about starting a family, and I was genuinely happy when I saw those 2 lines on the test. I told Daniel over dinner, and he cried a little, which I had not expected, and for about 48 hours everything felt exactly as it should. Then Daniel told his mother. Margaret's reaction, as Daniel relayed it to me with careful vagueness, was that we should think carefully about our financial readiness. She felt we had perhaps moved too quickly. She wanted Daniel to consult with her personal financial advisor, a man named Gerald, who I later discovered had been managing Margaret's assets for over 20 years, and whose loyalty was entirely to her about whether a situation was truly stable enough to support a child. I want to be very clear about something. My husband and I were financially stable. I had my trust. I had my salary from the firm where I was a senior analyst. Daniel had a solid income from his engineering position. We owned our home outright because I had put a significant down payment from my trust, and we had paid the mortgage off early. There was no rational financial concern. But Margaret was not operating from rationality. She was operating from a threat assessment, and the threat, I would come to understand, was me. Over the following weeks, something shifted in how Daniel spoke to me. Small things first. He began asking questions about my trust that he had never asked before. Innocent-sounding questions. How was the trust structured? Could it be moved into a joint account for better management? Had I thought about updating the beneficiaries? When I answered each one carefully and noted that my father had structured things deliberately and I saw no reason to change them, Daniel would nod and say, of course, and change the subject. But the questions always came back. I am a financial analyst. I know what a sustained line of questioning toward a specific asset looks like. It looks like due diligence before an acquisition attempt. I started paying closer attention. I began keeping notes in a private journal, dates, exact wording of conversations, anything that felt off. 3 months into my pregnancy, during one of Margaret's Sunday calls, I walked quietly into the hallway and listened. I heard Daniel ask his mother, almost word for word, whether there was any legal mechanism by which a spouse could petition for co-management of a trust if the primary holder was deemed to be making unsound decisions. I heard Margaret say she would ask Gerald. I heard Daniel say he was not sure how far they could take it, but that he thought the pregnancy was making me anxious and my judgment had not been the best lately. I stood in that hallway for a long time after the call ended. I was 4 months pregnant. My husband was in the next room. And the ground, very quietly, had just given way. The campaign that followed was methodical. Margaret began calling more frequently, always when Daniel was home. She would say things within his earshot, gentle, concerned-sounding things about how I had seemed overwhelmed lately, how she had noticed I was not sleeping, how she worried about the stress of my job on the pregnancy. She sent Daniel articles about prenatal anxiety. She suggested, through Daniel, that I should perhaps take a step back from work. She found a therapist she wanted me to see, one that, when I looked the woman up, had her practice located inside the same building as Gerald's financial advisory office. I did not tell Daniel what I had heard on the phone. I had learned something very important about him over those months, something that broke my heart even as I was cataloging it. My husband was not a cruel man. He was a weak one. He loved his mother in the absolute, unquestioning way that some people love the first authority figure who never abandoned them, and that love had made him into something she could pick up and point in whatever direction she chose. Confronting him directly would have sent him straight to her, and I needed time. I installed a recording application on my personal phone, and I began keeping it nearby during any conversation that felt significant. I want to be clear about why I did not act on what I was collecting immediately. I was building something that could not be partially built. If I had confronted Margaret or Daniel with incomplete evidence, they would have adjusted, covered their tracks, and made me look paranoid. My father taught me that in any dispute involving money and family, you do not show your hand until the hand is complete. You wait until you have everything, and then you lay it all on the table at once. At 5 months pregnant, something happened that changed the timeline. I had been experiencing some unusual symptoms, fatigue that went beyond normal pregnancy tiredness, headaches that arrived with strange consistency on the days following visits to Margaret's house, a persistent nausea that my OB was beginning to flag as atypical. She ordered additional blood work as a precaution. I did not think much of it at the time. I was managing a lot. The results came back on a Tuesday. My OB called me directly, not through the office portal, and asked me to come in alone if possible. When I sat across from her that afternoon, she showed me elevated levels of a compound in my blood that she described, very carefully, as consistent with the repeated ingestion of a specific herbal supplement in high doses, one that is known to cause complications in pregnancy, and that no competent physician would ever recommend to a pregnant woman. She asked me if I had been taking anything outside of my prescribed prenatal vitamins. I said no. She asked if anyone in my household might have had access to my food or beverages. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said that my mother-in-law made tea every time I visited. My OB's face did something I will never forget. She became very still and very professional, and she told me she was required to note her findings in my chart and that she strongly recommended I consider whether the environment I was in was safe for my pregnancy. She did not accuse anyone. She was careful and measured. But she looked at me the way you look at someone standing too close to the edge of something, and I understood. I left her office, and I sat in my car for 45 minutes. My daughter, whom I was already thinking of as a person, was moving against my ribs. I put my hand on my stomach and I made her a promise. I went home that evening, and I was completely normal. I made dinner. I asked Daniel about his day. I did not mention the appointment. That night, after he fell asleep, I called my father's estate attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled his trust and who I had maintained a quiet relationship with, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was silent for a moment and then she said, calmly and precisely, that I needed to do 3 things before I did anything else: document the medical findings, secure my financial accounts, and do not, under any circumstances, consume anything prepared by my mother-in-law again. Patricia also told me something that opened an entirely different door. She said that in the course of finalizing my father's trust documents years earlier, she had noticed some irregularities in the financial records Margaret had provided during a joint estate consultation she had briefly been included in. Patricia had flagged them at the time as outside her scope but had noted them. She had wondered, she said, if I might be interested in having a certified forensic accountant take a look at Margaret's management of my late father-in-law's estate, an estate that Margaret had been sole administrator of for 11 years. Since his death, I told her I was a certified forensic accountant. The next 6 weeks were the most focused and quietly terrifying of my life. I maintained every surface behavior of my marriage without deviation. I went to Sunday dinners. I accepted tea that I did not drink. I listened to Margaret talk about nursery colors and preschools, and I smiled at all the appropriate moments. Meanwhile, with Patricia's legal guidance and access to public financial records, I began pulling threads. What I found underneath Margaret's carefully maintained exterior was not subtle once you knew where to look. Over 11 years as administrator of my father-in-law's estate, Margaret had been making transfers to a personal account she had established under a variation of her name. Small amounts at first, the kind of amounts that look like administrative fees, like miscellaneous expenses, like nothing worth examining, but small amounts over 11 years accumulate. The total, when I finished my analysis, was just under $400,000. Money that by rights belonged to the estate, a portion of which was Daniel's inheritance. Margaret had been stealing from her own son for over a decade, and he had never once looked closely enough to see it. I also found Gerald. Gerald, the loyal financial advisor, had received a very consistent annual payment from Margaret's personal account for those same 11 years. Gerald, I was fairly certain, had been helping her structure the transfers to avoid scrutiny. Gerald had also been, I confirmed through his professional registration records, the advisor behind 2 previous attempts by clients to petition for co-management of spouses' individual trusts. Neither petition had succeeded, but both had been filed. He knew exactly how the process worked. I brought everything to Patricia. She sat with it for 2 days, and then she called me with the name of a district attorney's office investigator she trusted. She said the evidence was strong enough to take seriously. She said I needed to make decisions about what happened next. What happened next was a Thursday morning in November, 8 months pregnant, when I sat across from Daniel at our kitchen table before he left for work, and I placed a folder in front of him. I did not raise my voice. I had rehearsed the conversation enough times that the emotion was controlled, though my hands were shaking slightly under the table where he could not see them. I told him I knew about the conversations with his mother about my trust. I told him I had recordings. I told him I knew about the tea and about my medical results, and that those results were already documented with my physician and flagged in my chart. I told him I had been conducting a forensic audit of his father's estate for 6 weeks, and what I had found there. I laid the summary pages on the table in front of him, page by page, and I watched his face move through disbelief and then something that looked like nausea. He said, very quietly, that he had not known about any of it. He said he had asked questions about the trust because his mother had told him to, that she had said it was about protecting our family. He said he had not known she was poisoning me. He said that last part and then he put his face in his hands and he sat there for a long time while I waited. I believed him about the tea. I did not believe it changed anything. I told him that Patricia was filing a report with the DA's office that morning. I told him the recordings I had collected, combined with my medical documentation and the financial audit, constituted a comprehensive evidentiary package. I told him I had already transferred my personal effects from the house, and that I would be staying with a close friend until the situation resolved. I told him I intended to file for divorce, and that I had already retained a family law attorney who had reviewed the recordings and the estate findings and had noted that they would be relevant to any custody proceedings. Then I stood up, picked up my coat, and I left. Margaret was arrested 4 days later. The charges included elder financial abuse, the irony of that particular charge, given that the victim was her own son's inheritance, financial fraud, and, after investigators reviewed my medical records and spoke with my physician, a charge related to the deliberate administration of a harmful substance. The last charge was the most difficult to prove and ultimately reduced during the process, but it stayed in the record. It stayed where it mattered. Gerald's financial advisory license was suspended pending an ethics investigation. He did not keep his practice. Daniel did not fight the divorce. I think he was too exhausted and too shattered to fight anything. He called me once, the week after Margaret was charged, and told me he was sorry in a way that sounded genuine and hollow at the same time, the apology of a man who understands what happened but cannot fully grasp how he allowed it to happen. I accepted his apology the way you accept the weather, as a fact, not as something that changes your plans. Our daughter was born 6 weeks later, perfectly healthy, with her grandfather's dark eyes. I want to tell you something about that first night home from the hospital. I was in a borrowed guest room at my friend's house, and my daughter was asleep in a rented bassinet beside me, and the room was so quiet that I could hear her breathing. Small, even breaths. The most uncomplicated sound in the world. I lay there, and I tried to feel what I expected to feel: grief, maybe, or anger, or the particular exhaustion of someone who has just survived something terrible. What I felt instead was an enormous and almost frightening clarity. Like a window that has been dirty for so long you have forgotten glass is supposed to be transparent, and someone has finally cleaned it. I had spent 3 years in a house where the air itself was slowly being replaced with something unbreathable. I had mistaken that slow suffocation for the normal difficulty of marriage. I had told myself that discomfort was adjustment, that unease was sensitivity, that the instinct screaming at me from somewhere underneath my professional training and my grief-softened judgment was just anxiety, just hormones, just me being difficult. I had almost paid for that mistake with my daughter's life. There is a version of this story where I stayed, where I convinced myself that Daniel's weakness was forgivable and Margaret's hatred was manageable, and that the right thing to do was to keep the family intact for my child's sake. I have thought about that version. I have held it up and looked at it from every angle. And I will tell you this without hesitation. That version would have destroyed us both. You cannot protect a child by remaining inside a burning building and hoping the fire learns to stay in one room. The forensic accounting practice I opened 18 months after my daughter was born was not an act of revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge is reactive. It keeps you tethered to the thing that hurt you because it requires that thing to still exist, to still matter, to still be watching. I did not build my practice to punish anyone. I built it because I am extremely good at finding what people have tried to hide, and because the world, it turns out, has a significant need for that skill. I built it because I needed work that belonged entirely to me, not to a marriage, not to a mother-in-law's approval, not to anyone's agenda but my own. My daughter is 3 now. She is in our home, in my name, purchased with my assets and decorated according to exactly my taste. She has opinions about everything, and states them with a directness that makes me laugh every single day. Last week she informed me very seriously that the sky was her favorite color and that I should paint the living room to match it. I told her we could consider it. She told me considering was not the same as yes. She is, it turns out, exactly her grandfather's granddaughter. Margaret is serving a reduced sentence after a plea agreement. I have no feelings about this that I spend any significant time on. She is where the evidence took her. Daniel has relocated to another state and has a supervised visitation arrangement for our daughter that he exercises consistently and without drama. He is, in the absence of his mother's influence, a more present and functional person than I knew during our marriage. This does not make me regret leaving. It makes me understand, more fully, exactly what his mother cost him. I do not think about the woman I was at 28, the one who thought a man's love for his mother was a green flag. I do not think about her with contempt or pity. She was working with the information she had, grieving a father, building a life, doing what people in love do, extending trust before it has been fully earned. What I think about, when I think about that time at all, is the moment in my OB's office, when I understood what was happening, and I chose, deliberately and completely, not to fall apart. I was 4 months pregnant and sitting in a paper gown, and the person who was supposed to protect me had instead been directing a quiet campaign to have me declared incompetent, and I decided, in that moment, that I was not going to be a passive participant in my own destruction. That decision is the thing I am most proud of. Not the practice, not the financial independence, not the evidence I assembled or the charges that followed. The decision. The moment when I looked at what was happening and said, clearly and privately and with total conviction, not to me, not to my daughter, not anymore. There are women listening to this right now who are inside the version of this story that I was in at month 4. The version where the pressure is subtle enough to seem like normal friction, where the person hurting you is close enough to family that naming it out loud feels disloyal or dramatic, where you have been told, in 100 small ways, that your perception is the problem and not the reality your perception is accurately detecting. I want to say this directly to those women, because no one said it directly to me and I wish they had. You are not imagining it. Your pattern recognition is not broken. The instinct you keep dismissing as anxiety or oversensitivity is your clearest thinking, and it is trying very hard to protect you. Document everything. Build your evidence before you show your hand. Find a Patricia, a professional you trust, who is not inside the situation. And remember that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is the most responsible thing you can do for everyone who depends on you. The city is doing that thing it does in late October, where the light goes amber and low, and everything looks slightly more beautiful than it probably is. My daughter is asleep in the next room. The practice is busy. The window in my office faces east, and in the mornings the light comes through it like it has somewhere specific to be. This is what safety feels like when you build it yourself. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply is. The way a well-laid foundation is invisible when everything is working, but present in every wall that stands. Thank you for being here with me today. I need to ask you something before you go. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? Have you ever had to walk away from something that looked like family but was asking you to disappear inside it? I want to know. Tell me in the comments below, and please be as honest as you want to be, because this is a space for that kind of honesty. If today's story found you at the right moment, hit the like button and subscribe to Recovery Stories for more. New episodes every week. Your story matters, and so does your peace. Guard both of them accordingly.